So on Monday, I went to see my good friend and colleague, Jim Gordon. You've probably heard me talk about him through the years. We've both been pastors here for a number of years, but we met in Chicago at a conference 25 years ago and became really dear friends and colleagues. We studied together for quite a few years. Jim was the pastor at Pine Ridge Presbyterian Church up in the Northland until just last fall when he retired early because of cancer. He'd had that kind of cancer that was just really sort of an annoyance. It was kind of like sitting over here on the shelf. He'd have to go in and monthly have these treatments until about a year ago when the doctor said to him, "You've probably got 5 years to live." And he was like, "What?" And the doctor was like, "Or we could do this really risky bone marrow transplant. And then, 3 in 10 people don't make it out for a year or two. But if you made it, then you could probably live a lot longer." It was one of those kind of bends in the road that really makes you think, what has meaning to you? What's your value? And he thought, of course, about the day 30 years ago when he had a stroke, no health issues, great shape. And he remembered them wheeling out of his church in Iowa, looking up at the stained glass, thinking, would he see his daughter graduate from kindergarten? And now he had the thought about his newborn granddaughter, and so he decided to go for it. So now he's 2 months out of that transplant, and we've been visiting quite a bit. And on Monday, when I went to see him, I had a couple of things I wanted to talk to him about. One was a challenge at the church I wanted his ideas about, and one was the parable. And he had a couple of things he wanted to talk about, like the meaning of life. And he wanted to talk about the challenges we've each had and kind of what they've taught us. He's had these 3 kind of strange health issues. There was the stroke, there was an open heart surgery, and then there's cancer. And he said, interestingly enough, most of the healing he's experienced in life came from those illnesses. Those illnesses ended up being this incredible treasure. And he asked me again about, the challenge I went through 12 years ago and kind of what I'd learned from that. And you all have heard me talk about it, that most of our life we're a triangle. We kind of move a little bit, especially when we get a little older. But then there are those moments when life breaks us open and we're like this, right? And we move a whole lot more. And my friend Misty reminded me what a wreck I was yesterday during that. We had met in Oklahoma City 12 years ago. She's head of leadership development at a giant company, and she was trying to help me figure out what am I going to do now that the building my ladder was against is gone. And it was really a time, I was a mess, but it was also the richest, most incredible time of my life, especially the year after it. It was like every single thing was so vivid and beautiful and vibrant, and it was just this most alive. I learned more in that year than I learned in the 30 years before. But I could remember that there was a moment when that kind of time of real radiant growth was kind of coming to an end. I can remember I was getting more whole, I was getting more put together, but it was such a rich, incredible time of just meaning where it really made me think what matters to me and where do I want to put my life. Today the parables come to us and they say that to us. What is your treasure and what is your pearl of great price? In some ways, like I said, these parables are tricky because they only show up here, and at first, they're kind of in the vernacular. Everybody's kind of heard these parables, but they have a little trick to them. In the first one, there is a plowman, someone who's plowing a field, and he finds some treasure. It's unexpected. He's not looking for it. And then he hides it, and then he goes and he buys the field. He takes every single thing he has, and he buys this field. In some ways we can identify. I always think, what if you're in an antique store and you pick up a painting, right, and you just really want the frame, but then it turns out underneath there, original copy of the Declaration of Independence, right? And so you pay the $15, you get the frame, you get out of there really quickly. But in the parable, you actually have to buy the entire antique mall to get that, okay? He had to sell every single thing he had. You have to buy the whole strip mall, right, to get that. And it seems like, well, it's still a good idea, right, because this is an incredible treasure. But the tricky part is this. In antiquity, it's a little trickier. Like, we think finders, keepers, losers, weepers, right? And there's some of that. There were some places in the ancient Near East where if you found something, it was yours. But in Roman law, there was a lot of real kind of rigid rules, too, about treasure that you'd find. Like, if you came upon coins on the road and they were scattered, they were yours for the taking. But if you came upon coins on the road and they were like stacked up neatly or they were in a row, they belonged to the original. If someone was coming back for them, you couldn't touch them. And if you bought a field, you know, and then you found a treasure on it, the first 7 years that treasure belonged to the person you bought the field from. From year 7 to 14, you divided it, and after 14, it was yours. So it's kind of tricky here. Like, again, you got to think about this. The parables were remembered because they challenged and they upset and they disrupted. So the first people who heard this would have been like, yeah, I don't know if this guy, is he morally, this is not really necessarily a good moral thing. He's kind of snuck away with this. But then it's also like he's also kind of stupid because he really, now that he's bought the field, he really can't have the treasure legally for 14 years. So, but at the heart of it, the parable says this: whatever that treasure was that was so unexpected is so valuable to him that he is willing to sell every single thing he has for this treasure, right? Maybe it's a cure for cancer, maybe it's shalom, maybe it's an economy and a democracy that works for everybody. We don't know, but he's willing to give everything for this treasure. The next parable is similar but different. In this parable, the person is looking for treasure. This person is a merchant who is looking for fine pearls. But then the merchant finds one pearl of great price, and the merchant decides to give every single thing, to sell every single thing he has to get that one pearl. Well, we think, okay, you know, he's found what he wants. But again, in antiquity, merchants and pearls were both kind of suspect. Merchants, you know, we think, you know, they were dishonest and they were trying to trick people, and so people didn't really respond very well. Pearls, remember the lesson in Timothy that women are not supposed to go around with their hair braided and fine clothing and wearing pearls. So pearls were also kind of considered ostentatious. And then this guy's kind of stupid because he sold every single thing he has for this pearl. At least the previous person has got a field, which is an asset, right? You can farm your field, or you can rent it out, or you can, you know, graze your oxen on it. This guy is sitting in his boxer shorts on the curb holding this pearl, right? I mean, he's sold every single thing for this pearl. He's sitting there with this pearl, which what's he going to eat now, okay? But the other Gospel of Thomas, which again doesn't have the two parables together, kind of has a little bit of a different thing, because it says here the guy had a burden of goods. He had a load of goods. So he has unloaded himself. He has unburdened himself. So in a way, he's sort of shed that clutter. You know, he's kind of decided to get rid of all that extra stuff for the sake of this one thing he really wants. Both parables have that same thing. They are both about figuring out, knowing what you want, and giving every single thing for it. In one point, stumbles upon the treasure, and the other point, the treasure finds him. Neil King Jr. Was a person who found the treasure, but first it found him. He was a Wall Street Journal reporter, reported for the New York Times, Atlantic, won a Pulitzer for his 9/11 coverage. So in many ways, he's a person who knows a great deal about this country. And he also knows a great deal about himself, because at 61, he'd had two surprising illnesses. He got bit by a tick, he had Lyme disease, nearly lost his voice completely, and then cancer kind of snuck up and bit him and nearly took him. And so he writes in his book, American Ramble, about what loss taught him, about the treasure that he found when he wasn't expecting it. And in this little part, he talks about losing his voice. When you can't talk well, you really have to listen. You hear stories that are new to you from your wife, your daughters, old friends. You listen more closely to the pond frogs at night, to the red-winged blackbirds in the reeds, to the crickets that lingered in the trees all the way into early November. You note the night when the last of those crickets sang. Loss has a strange way of bringing us things in return. My cancer gave me gifts I never expected. I became, for one, deeply attuned to trees. On every trip to the hospital, I would stand in silence before a stately elm in Georgetown and marvel at its grace in all seasons. Loss has a strange way of bringing us things in return. He wasn't searching for sure for that treasure, but it found him, and then in many ways it pushed him to go out searching for even more treasure. For many years he had had this idea, which had been kind of sharpened really during the Trump years, of wanting to kind of recover the soul of this country. He had this idea that he would leave his house in Washington, D.C., just a few blocks from the Capitol, and we walked 330 miles to New York City. He would take back roads, he would go through these Amish-covered bridges, He would trace the Mason-Dixon line and look at that place of deep divisiveness in this country, and he would try to find the soul of this country. He was going to set out at the end of March 2020, but then COVID came, right? He ended up delaying the trip for a year, and he said if you had told him in March of 2020 that in the next year an illness you've never heard of will take 1 million Americans, and there'll be a man named George Floyd who will be killed, and there will be an incredible racial reckoning, and then there will be this attack on the Capitol, so that when you set out in March of 2021, it will still be surrounded with wire and barricades. He would have never believed it. But he set out in March of 2021 on this walk. And in many ways, what he encountered were things that he as a journalist had sort of not pre-planned, but he knew enough to think, I'm going to plant some people, I'm going to have some interviews, I'm going to talk to some people that I really want to meet along the way. 1 or 2 of those set up each day. So he met a guy who was kind of the informal history keeper in York, Pennsylvania. And that guy told him about another person, Samantha Dorm. She was the informal keeper of the Black history of York, Pennsylvania. She was 4th generation there. And for years, she had been going to the Lebanon Cemetery. It was a cemetery for Blacks in that area, and laying flowers on her grandparents' grave. But in 2019, she sort of started tidying up the place with some friends, and they started noticing treasure, really buried treasure, all these grave markers that had sunk into the ground, realizing there might be dozens of people buried there, not just her relatives. So they'd gotten a metal detector, and they began looking for these gravestones, and they found 1,000 residents who'd been buried there. People whose histories and lives had been lost, teachers and preachers and leaders on the abolitionist underground movement, people who had been like the first revolutionary soldier to die, and soldiers who'd fought for all kinds of wars, and all kinds of leaders, people whose lives inform us, whose lives our children need to be taught about, whose resilience and strength and courage is exactly what we need right now, right, to help us go through these turbulent times. And then he found some people along the way that were just totally a surprise. The treasure just jumped up and got him. Like he was walking through Lancaster County, through Amish world, right? And he came upon these middle school kids at recess, the 8th and 9th grade girls and boys. The girls were out there, they were wearing these long flowery dresses, right? And these bonnets. And the boys were out there playing too. And they were wearing plain pants and shirts. And they were playing softball, like competitive softball, like he had never seen people playing softball, running and jumping as fast as they could. These girls in these long dresses. He just watched the softball game like in amazement at the way these kids were playing. Then when it was over, they wanted to run over and ask this guy, this stranger who was there, why he was there. After he told them, then the kids invited him, would you come inside and listen to us sing? So these 8th, 9th graders gathered on these risers and sang him these songs about kingdom of heaven, songs about a different world, songs about a world of peace and joy and love. And he said it was just like this unbelievable moment standing in the Farmersville Mennonite school while these kids serenaded him. It happened to him over and over and over again. These moments of inexplicable joy, sitting in a tavern, some historic tavern in some little town in Pennsylvania. The rain began to pour. He was drinking a beer and eating, listening to the conversation, and he just started to sob at the gift of being alive. It just happened over and over again on this walk. And he said if the 330 miles taught him anything, it's this: when you walk out the door in the morning, if you're looking for treasure, if you're looking for joy and awe and wonder and beauty, find it, right? If you walk out the door looking for kindness and connection, find it, right? He made so many connections, made so many close friends in this span of a month that it took him back to Washington, D.C., back to the little street he lived on. And he thought all about all the people he passed every morning, whose stories he didn't know, who were a treasure that he hadn't discovered. And it changed him. My friend Jim, in many ways, was very fortunate, because he had that stroke when he was just 32. It found him, that treasure. He thinks about it now quite often. He remembers still, being wheeled out of that church in Dallas Center, Iowa, looking up at the stained glass, thinking, would he live?
And he remembers, too, being at the hospital in Des Moines and his wife, Marcia, talking to the doctor. And the doctor was trying to convince Marcia, who had 2 tiny children, that she needed to airlift Jim to Rochester to the Mayo Clinic. And Marcia was arguing with him and saying, this is our community, this is our home, how could we possibly do that? And Jim said he just had this experience, never before, never since, March 1st, 1994, this experience in that room, listening to his wife and the doctor and people, of just the unbelievable, inexplicable, overwhelming love of God. Just so enveloped in this feeling of love. Just, even now, he can close his eyes and feel it. And that love has been, for my friend Jim, the pearl of great price. He's had moments when he strayed from it. You know, they built this big sanctuary, and then the recession of 2008, so much stress. They decided to embrace marriage equality, and they lost people he loved, people he'd stood with and prayed over. So painful. And he'd still come back to that experience of that overwhelming sense of love and knowing at his heart that's what it was all about. The parables look at us today and they resist easy answers. But instead they look at us and they ask us this: what is your treasure? What is your pearl of great price? Really? And what are you willing to give for it? What are you willing to let go of, to unburden? And are you really open to risk, to transform, to become new? Amen.